So today's episode, we'll be talking about some South and Central American governments and how they relate to imperialism. And like, there's a very long history there, um, especially like under the influence of the U.S. in the last like century or two. All right, so we decided to do this in a chronological order. So I'm going to be talking about Panama, and Neil is going to be talking about Honduras and I believe Nicaragua. So
Yeah.
without further ado, so here's my spiel on the Isthmus of Panama and the Panama Canal.
And
Yes.
before he gets into it, I think it's important to note that this is not an exhaustive list of instances of American interventionism in Latin America. That video would be like 90 hours long. These are just some these are just some examples we thought were really interesting, and so we highly recommend you guys do your own research.
All
So,
right.
without further ado,
All right. So the Isthmus of Panama is a strategic strip of land that's between South and Central America, and 5% of global trade today. Your video turned off. 5% of global trade today goes through this strip, goes through this canal. Or now there's a canal there. Originally there wasn't. So because of its narrowness and its like strategic location, efforts were made throughout history to create a canal linking the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. But we'll see later that not all of these actually like turn out that well. So the first attempt is the French attempt, and they had this guy Ferdinand de Lesseps, who essentially was the guy who did the Suez Canal, right? Which is actually kind of interesting because we have like current events that are linking to that, which is also a very interesting and strategic location today with a lot of global trade. So the French fail for a bunch of reasons, but we don't have to talk about all those reasons. The point is that there was a lot of brutality, and they really weren't ready for like the situation that is Central America, right? It's not the same thing as Egypt. So there was actually a lot of brutality and a lot of deaths of workers there because they were put into these conditions, and the architects and everything weren't really ready for what was going to happen. So they failed. So the French brought Indian and Jamaican workers, and thousands of them died to malaria and poor planning and lack of foresight by the French before construction. So fast forward to 1904, Roosevelt wants a way to bring the Navy from the east to the west coast without having to circumnavigate South America, so he tried to strike a deal with Colombia. Now, a lot of people ignore this, but the reason they could not come to an agreement with the U.S. is because the U.S. refused to make an agreement where they did not have complete and sovereign control over the land that rightfully belonged to Colombia. So we can come back to that later. But the point, like the takeaway here for me, is that like it's not just like a footnote that says, oh well, they refused to make a deal, whatever. It's that the U.S. It wouldn't have even been a equitable deal. The idea of the deal was just that the U.S. would get complete control over an area that belongs to a completely different country, which is kind of a recurring theme with imperialist powers and strategic locations. So he's bent on getting his land in a different way. So the U.S. backs a Panamanian independence like movement from Colombia in exchange for control over that desired land in order to build that canal. So Roosevelt knows that this is super sketchy as far as global affairs go. So he kind of talks to his guy Knox, who like the famous American. So Knox, and he literally tells him, "Mr. President," and this is in quotes. I have the quote right here. Ah, Mr. President, do not let so great an achievement suffer from any taint of legality. So this basically translates in my eyes as "Who cares? We're the U.S." Which is kind of an attitude that's highly present today. And the way I see it is that what Knox is saying is just like, not only would legality like hinder the deal, but it would like it's a taint. It's like a negative side of the deal, that it would be legal and that it would be like equitable for both sides, which just shows you how like one-sided American interventionism really is. So decades later, like in the end, this is like a huge fast forward. Jimmy Carter ends up giving back the Panama Canal to Panama. So this seems like it would be the end of the story, but the legacy of the construction still exists today. So the first thing that I think is important to talk about is the workers that were involved. The first railroad, we're talking back about the French who built a railroad there, was in the 19th century, and it was built by Irish and Chinese workers, not French workers. So the French sea level canal that was built afterwards, the failed one, or kind of like a smaller version, that was built by Indian and Jamaican workers. Then, the American Lock Canal was built by different Caribbean, Central, and South American workers. In the present day, Panama, I think it was in like 2014, they built an expansion to it. And this was the first time that it was built on by Panamanians. So you can see that when imperialist powers build stuff, they're building it using the manpower or person power, I guess, of other people across the world and importing labor. While when Panama was expanding on it, they just used Panamanian labor and they were valued as human beings and not just workers. So the Panama Canal had a death toll of about 5,600 workers, but this is only the official death toll, and most people assume that it's kind of most likely a lot larger. Now, out of those 5,600 people, only 350 of them were white, and black workers were 4 times more likely to die than white workers, which just shows you the unequitable working conditions. So, the next part about workers that I want to talk about, and I'll try to make this quick, but there's a large amount of segregation, and it's kind of interesting because we literally imported segregation to Panama. Colored workers were given like really terrible living conditions, which is why a lot of them died, and they were paid in silver and weaker local currencies. Um, and on the other hand, white workers were paid in gold, hence they were called the gold roll. So the people living in the Panama Canal Zone that the U.S. controlled described a caste system where every shade of a man corresponded to his rank, salary, and general treatment. Meaning that if you were white versus if you were colored, that would be a completely different working condition. And there were even separate parts of the city, grocery stores, and housing specifically built to effectively segregate the population. So I read a bunch of sources, and essentially people say that, well, segregation isn't that big nowadays. People, like even their parents or grandparents, still remember times where segregation was a huge deal in Panama because if these people were treated completely differently. They had separate housing and completely separate salaries and completely separate wealth situations. So it really goes to show the sheer amount of segregation that came just from building one piece of infrastructure by the U.S. So on the topic of imperialism, as far as imperialism goes in Panama, there's a lot more details, there's a lot more to say. As with most things that we talk about, we don't have that much time. But one example would be the invasion and bombings that killed thousands of civilians, which maybe we'll talk about in the future. But for this episode, I just wanted to specifically talk about the imperialist strategy of deliberate territorial acquisition. So last episode, we talked about the brutality of Japanese imperialism and the terrible, terrible situations that inhabitants of the conquered territory went through. So in this segment, I guess, I talked about the recurring theme of imperialism, where they have strategic control over specific routes important to globalization. So other examples that maybe we'll talk about in the future, I don't know, would be Gibraltar, the Strait of Gibraltar in Spain, the Suez Canal, and the Bosphorus. And actually, out of these three, none of them are owned by their respective countries. So the Strait of Gibraltar, I believe, is still owned by the British, or I might be wrong about that. The Suez Canal is, or at least was, controlled by European powers. I believe now Egypt has a much larger say. And the Bosphorus, I believe until 2028 or something, because they signed like a 9,900-year deal, the Bosphorus in Turkey is still owned by the British. So it just goes to show it's a very recurring theme, it's a very common thing that they used to do, which is that they would control territories. And that just goes back to the deal that they tried to make with Panama, the US tried to make with Panama, where they said, we don't just want to make this canal, we want complete control over everything that goes on, because we don't want to share anything with the rightful owners of this place. So that is my segment on the Panama Canal. Neil, do you want to go?
Okay, so you just heard Elise talk about Panama, and this is in the early 1900s. Now, this kind of strategy of intervening and basically getting into Latin and Central American countries' business is a theme that's going to continue up until the 21st century. And so in Nicaragua, it's no different. So the US had been intervening throughout the 20th century, even in the early 1900s. But what we're going to focus on is probably some of the biggest atrocities that happened around the 70s to the late 80s. Now, to understand what happened during this time period, you have to understand who was ruling, what was the ruling class in Nicaragua. And so, leading into the 80s and to the early 70s, this country had been under the rule of the Somoza regime. Now, the Somozas are basically a political family that had run the National Guard, and they came to power through some pretty bloody stuff. So this family came to power into 1936 when Anastasio Somoza, the oldest one, right, and the father of future dictators, we'll get to that later, lured in a rebel leader and chief political adversary Augusto Cesar Sandino to peace talks and then murdered him. Anastasio then altered the Nicaraguan constitution, allowing him to remain in power and to put his cronies and relatives and friends in powerful government positions. And so this oligarchy slash dictatorship basically ran Nicaragua, but they did face resistance throughout the regime because they were especially bloody. Their main resistance was the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or the FSLN, which eventually kicked the Somoza regime outside the country in 1979. And so, some fun facts here: the chief Somoza in charge, is the son of Anastasio, actually fled to Paraguay in 1979 after obviously the FSLN won the Nicaraguan Revolution, and they were chased down by a very like inglorious bastard specialized military group. And so this Sandinista group was armed, and they like detailed this really carefully by two Soviet-made machine guns, two AK-47 assault rifles, two automatic pistols, and an RPG-7 rocket launchers with four anti-tank grenades and two rockets. They sent all of this to get one guy. Their leader, an Argentinian Marxist revolutionary, Enrique Gorrian Merlo, nicknamed Ramon, said, "We cannot tolerate the existence of millionaire playboys while thousands of Latin Americans are dying of hunger. We are perfectly willing to give up our lives for this cause." Now, Somoza's body was apparently so badly brutalized, they shot an RPG at him that authorities had to recognize him by his feet. So that was just a side note to show how much they hated the Somoza regime. But before you go feeling too bad for this guy, you have to remember that the Somozas were a pretty unique brand of evil. Anastasio would frequently take blood plasma from the poorest of his country and then illegally sell it to the United States for profit, for his own profit. And then, when a disastrous earthquake in the 1970s leveled the capital of Nicaragua, Managua, Somoza embezzled international aid into his own pockets and then continued to use Nicaraguan medical supplies to continue selling blood plasma for his own gain, which ended up slowing the process down. Even nearly 50 years after this disaster, the main city of Managua is still not fixed, and there are still broken areas from that disastrous earthquakes. Uh, in addition, when the FSLN finally took charge of uh, the government had almost $14 billion of debt and apparently had a grand total of $12 million left in the treasury. The rest had been stolen or laundered into the Somoza personal accounts. So these guys basically just use the country to make money. But this is where the US gets involved. And so the US, and mainly Reagan, did not want the far left ruling Nicaragua. The FSLN was a heavily Marxist group that did a bunch of things, like they basically centralized the education system and they set up monthly payments, they raised the minimum wage. And Reagan didn't want that. He did not want far left leaders ruling in anywhere in Latin America. So Reagan funneled support and money into a group called the Contra. Now, the Contra was basically a far right resistance, which wanted to take back the country and bring it, back to the far right, because they just went from the far right to the far left. And so, the extent of which the U.S. supported the Contra is pretty incredible, from political to financial aid. The CIA literally knew about their operations and helped them out oftentimes, and they also funneled millions of dollars, sometimes even against the will of Congress. Now, going into like the specificities of how much the U.S. helped is going to a little beyond my scope here. It's going to take too much time, but it's really important to note that the Contra were a very evil group of people. If you go, and it's very gruesome, and so we'll put a trigger warning here. They were very well known for the raping and torturing of many civilians, and their death tolls went far above 30,000. And so there's 30,000 recorded deaths, but similar to what Elias mentioned in Panama, many suspect that the death toll is much higher because oftentimes they would rape women and then kill the unborn child. And so the Contra are a very evil group of people, which Reagan wanted in charge. And so there's a lot of political tensions that happened here. Afterwards, the far right would actually win politically because what's interesting is the Sandinistas, the Marxist government that took charge, actually reinstated democratic elections. And so the far right would win political elections because of the financial crisis that would hit Nicaragua. But again, it's really important to note, and going back to the major theme, is that U.S. interventionism literally supported death squads, aka the Contra, and inadvertently, or actually not inadvertently, pretty clearly led to the death of almost 31,000 people just because Reagan did not want far left leaning leaders. Uh, and so there's a lot more to this because of time issues. I'm gonna keep it pretty like prompt here. Maybe we'll do a part two or another episode on this because it definitely deserves more talking to. But again, very important lesson on some of the hypocrisy of the US saying we support democracies and then supporting literally an attempt to reinstate dictatorships, uh, reinstating, trying to basically supporting death squads and terrorists, which killed civilians. And right now, this is a note for Neil. Put the picture of Nixon and Somoza somewhere here because it's a pretty nice picture. Somoza's a dictator who would embezzle and steal from the poorest of the nation, and there's a picture of Nixon and Somoza chatting up. And Eli's just seen the picture. There's a very nice chandelier there. Now we're going to focus, and so we're going to go into Honduras. And so you might be wondering why we're jumping around so much. Why don't we go into depth? And the reason why I want to talk about Honduras is because when I'm talking about history, it's really easy to disassociate. You know what I mean? Because a lot of the stuff that happens won't directly affect you. It's oftentimes a butterfly effect, and that's what the beauty of history is. It's like a Rube Goldberg machine sort of picture. If you guys don't know what that is, it's just like a small domino effect that leads to these crazy things, and you don't really think about it. So I want to contextualize it and make it real. And so I'm going to make it real by talking about Honduras. And so this is kind of like a tangent. Uh, in Honduras, there was a military coup, and this is a textbook case of U.S. interventionism. And so you might think, oh, this happened in the early 1900s or happened in the 80s. No, this happened in 2009 under Barack Obama. And so on June 28th, 2009, armed Honduras soldiers captured the democratically elected and left leaning President Manuel Zelaya and took him out of his home. And they would eventually put him in a Costa Rican prison where he supposedly was tortured. However, the sources are kind of shaky on that, so I'm going to put an asterisk. Uh, Manuel Zelaya was a left leaning politician who had done a lot for his country. He had raised the minimum wage, he had provided free school lunches, milk for young children, pensions for the elderly, and additional scholarships for students. He'd built new schools, subsidized public transportation, and even distributed energy-saving light bulbs. Zelaya was very active, and a lot of people really liked him. And although these reforms were generally frowned upon by the conservatives in his country, they definitely didn't warrant him being taken out of his house in pajamas, right, by military soldiers, right? But what did put the nail in the coffin for him was his decision to legally and democratically change the Honduras constitution, which basically allowed the US to have insane hegemony over the country, insane power over the country. Now, this constitution was instituted under the US backed dictator Policarpo Paz Garcia, and it gave the US incredible power over the Honduran economy and political spectrum. The US could do a lot of things with that constitution, and when Zelaya made the move to actually get rid of it and to change it to have Honduras having its own hegemony and power, hegemony basically means sovereignty, individuality, to the ability to do things and have some influence over their area. That's really the first domino, the straw that broke the camel's back. So there's a lot of stuff that happens in this coup, but we're just going to focus on the US's relationship and how they fueled the flames. So the leader of the coup, my apologies, was General Romeo Vasquez, who was incidentally a graduate of the School of the America. The School of the Americas is a US Army training program dubbed the School of Assassins. And this program earned its name due to its reputation for training coup leaders and military leaders known for their torture and murder of political opponents. It's a Cold War institution that literally teaches leaders how to be more fascist and how to, basically torture their political allies to getting to what they want. And so that's just the first step of how the U.S. Was involved in this. But the U.S., in addition, pretty actively defended and supported this coup, although in public they were very quiet about it. Hillary Clinton was addressed in a press conference about the Honduran coup, which basically started in the beginning of 2008. She was very wishy-washy. However, later reports find that Hillary Clinton knew about the coup and actively didn't do anything about it. And what's really massive here is you have to remember the US openly violated not only international law, but their own domestic protocol by refusing to embargo the newly overthrown country. And then also, they were found to be working in close communication with the newly run Honduras government. CIA analysts and staffer found that many Honduras higher ups directly cited US involvement in the coup, stating that the disenfranchisement of socialism in Latin America was in both the US and the rightist leaders' interest. Basically, many Honduran leaders said that the US supported them. And for those who don't know, when a US ally is overthrown by a coup, the first thing you're supposed to do is economically separate themselves from the new government in order to basically dissuade them from taking over control. It's a safety measure to stop coup leaders from taking over the countries because they know, oh, if I do this, the US is going to embargo us and our economy is going to go like all the way down. It's going to get really bad. The US actively didn't do this and started working with the new government almost immediately, which is incredibly fishy. This new far right Honduras regime is directly responsible for this country's recent instability. And Honduras, leading into 2008, was becoming an incredibly modern country with a booming economy. And now it has the highest murder rate in the world. And it is ranked the worst country to be an environmental activist. Activists are basically hunted down in Honduras, and many activists in the country had been killed or tortured by this new dictator. Series of, in addition, there's a series of corrupt Honduran leaders, basically who have abandoned their democratic ideals, and they have continued being elected, basically with the US's support. It's important to know that Hillary Clinton nor Obama have condemned this political travesty. And the reason why I brought this up in the first place is I want to connect it back to basically something that recently happened a couple years ago. There was a caravan, and Elias, if you want to jump in to talk about this, is some funny things that I think it was Pence who brought up that there were Middle Easterns in this caravan. For those of you who don't know, we're going to put like a picture. Almost 15,000 immigrants coming from Honduras came to the US because of the country's recent instability and incredibly high murder rate and violence. And Elias, you want to bring up?
Yeah. So
Yeah,
so it was just this like funny moment. I mean, a lot of people probably remember it. It was just like a couple years ago, I guess, where there's this caravan coming up of like literally. I mean, maybe not refugees, but the point is like there are people that are seeking asylum seekers, and to kind of demonize them. Pence says, we have intel that there's like some Middle Easterners here, like as if like people from ISIS would have gone like from Syria or Iraq or whatever, and they flew all the way down to South or Central America and then walked like thousands of miles up the border to seek asylum when they could have literally just like flown in or and literally any other way.
with their young children as well.
Yeah, of course.
Crazy. If you cannot tell, we are being incredibly sarcastic. It literally felt like something out of an SNL skit. You know what I mean? But the reason why I'm bringing this up is because when those 15,000 people arrived at the US border, Trump, oh, my apologies. The 15,000 number, it is much more than 15,000. President Trump threatened to send 15,000 US soldiers to stop this caravan of tens of thousands of Honduras immigrants. So my apologies. I'll put an asterisk there. It's not 15,000. But the main message that I want to say is Democrat or Republican, right? From Obama to Trump, we have seen a basically a sense of what is it? Apathy. Basically, U.S. leaders don't care about Central American civilians, and they don't care about what happens to these democracies because as long as the U.S. has power and hegemony over those areas, it doesn't matter, and it doesn't matter how they get that. They've been doing it since 1909 with the Panama Canal. They did it in the 80s with Reagan's death squads. They did it in 2009 with Obama's Honduran coup. And when the immigrants come knocking to the US's door, asking for asylum for the issue that the US created and definitely fueled, the US would turn their back on them. And so at the end of the day, that's the biggest thing here that we want to point out is this complete hypocrisy. Uh, Being called the defenders of the free world and then turning our back on asylum seekers, even though we are the ones who force them to go and seek asylum, is it's mind-boggling. And again, that's partly the reason why we wanted to make this podcast and inform these people, because the more you know about US current events and the more you know about our history of violence across the world, the more likely we can be better Americans and we can strive to become this symbol, this idealistic version of the US we've been saying we are. Because the only way we can be the defenders of the free world is if we accept our past and make active changes. And so, yeah, that's going to be the end of our episode. I went a little bit too long. Elise,
No,
you want to add anything?
no, that was excellent. I definitely learned a lot, and I mean, I think this is a good time.
Thank you so much for watching. Please share with your friends. Please feel free to like. And yeah, we're going to be releasing more videos. If you guys have any suggestions of areas of the world we should cover, we might have to do a part 2 on Latin and Central America, just because there is so much to talk about that deserves to be talked about. But for now, that's going to be our episode. Elis, do you have any final words?
That was awesome, absolutely. No, follow us on Twitter, Spotify,
That's it.
Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Twitch, anywhere where books are sold. All right.
And if you follow us, click the notification button. If you've done all that, make a second account and follow us and do it all
Again,
again.
yes.
All right, 3, 2, 1, cut.